the nature of the modern media. It's very fast moving. People want instant answers and journalists want instant answers. So often with topics such as coal seam gas or things that involve a lot of science, it's a very difficult thing to get interest the media because they want something quite instant. But the way I thought I would tackle it is give a bit of an idea of how a journalist actually goes about assembling a story, about the way that they bring the information together and the things that they're looking for, so that you might be able to have some insight into what will attract and encourage them to cover the topic. Firstly though, overall I'd just like to say that agriculture has really two sector templates that I think that it can learn or how they get media coverage. And ironically, it actually comes from the two groups that they're most often in opposition to, which is the mining sector and the Greens movement. Both are extremely effective at generating media coverage, much to the chagrin of landholders, but there's a lot of lessons that can be learnt in how they actually go about attracting the interest of the media, because they both go about it in two very different ways. Firstly, I'd say that the mining sector bases most of its arguments on economics. They push the point that any opposition to their sector will cost jobs, government revenue, and most importantly will raise the costs of the average Australian's household budget. And this, for a metropolitan audience, is probably the biggest thing that they're interested in, and the biggest thing that the audience, that the journalist is also interested in. On the other hand, the Greens, they base their arguments on emotions. So it's often a lot of images, you've got your cute animals and you've got your long mournful music and all the rest of that stuff that they go with. But the thing about, as we know, the thing though that's interesting is neither can really argue the opposite, in as much as the mining sector would have a hard time trying to argue the emotions of the sector and how emotionally there's not a lot of cuteness in a coal seam gas well or in an open cut coal mine. The same as the economics with the Green movement. It's very difficult for them to argue that a lot of their policies are actually going to benefit the bottom line of most people's budgets. So there's a lot of I would argue they're narrower in what they're actually able to argue compared to the agriculture sector, which has really both. It has the ability to be able to argue the economics of the situation, has the ability to be able to argue the benefits that their sector provide to the bottom line of this economy. Like you saw John McVeigh come up before and give all those figures about the contribution it makes to the economy. However, the sector also has the ability to to work on the emotions of their small businesses. These are family farms. These are groups of people who have long histories and long associations with the community and contribute a lot to their local communities as well. And so basically that's where I think it's at, is that the agriculture sector doesn't give itself probably enough credit into how much scope it really has to be able to argue varying different points. The other thing I'd probably say is, today we've seen a lot of people bring reports and we've seen a lot of science, there's a lot of legislation. I think was it Trent or Joanne, somebody said that PRA is very focused on good science and good legal advice. And while that's extremely important to a journalist, to a metropolitan audience, and it's a difficult thing to be able to sum up in 500 words, is that complex scientific arguments, complex legal arguments, the rural sector is not a large enough group within the broad community of Australia to be able to attract the centimetres in a newspaper that really would be required to be able to argue huge scientific information. And that's why the mining sector, again, is very similar in that they will use economics and things like that to argue. It doesn't mean that science should not be considered by the metropolitan journalist. However, it does mean there's an element of needing to, for lack of a better term, dumb it down. It needs to be summarised very easily so that journalists can understand it, because there's an old saying in journalism that you need to be able to write the article so a 7-year-old child can understand it. And so if the journalists themselves can't understand the science quickly and has to spend lots of time wading through lots of reports, especially given that rural information is sometimes not their expertise, they're less likely to finish it, given that the modern nature of metropolitan media, it's so fast moving that they just move on to the next thing. So the other thing, basically So like I've said, while success with the metropolitan media can't be guaranteed, I think I've written about 5 things that I think everyone could really consider when they're trying to attract the media and think about how they're going to present their case to the media in order to better be able to engage with metropolitan audiences. The first one is images. And as we saw with Trent before, when he gave his presentation, with the judge, he's looking at the images, and that really told a story. If the rural sector cannot get the centimetres in a newspaper to tell a story that it needs in words, as the saying goes, an image is worth 1,000 words. So it can sum up a lot of things. Again, the green sector's very, very good at this. That's why a bloody business was so successful in being able to stop the trade, was because it had that emotional reaction because of those images that people saw. And that's the reason that the animal rights people obviously went over to Indonesia with a video camera, was to provide those images. But the rural sector is probably second only to foreign affairs, foreign correspondence, is that when you actually look at a newspaper page, the images of the rural life, of shearing or mustering or whatever they're filming, is something that a newspaper editor wants to put on their page. And the first thing that everyone, when they've done science studies into how people read a newspaper page, the image is the first thing that catches their eye. And that means if you can get a strong image, the rest of the story will be built around that. And so a lot of groups, a lot of ag groups, a lot of farmers, a lot of people are reluctant to take images, are reluctant to provide images, but really the image is the centrepiece of what, if you can provide a strong image, no matter what that is of, the rest of the story will follow, and they're more likely to actually follow through with it, because the editor or the chief of staff or something will say, that's a great image, we need to get that on the page. And like I said before, with the foreign affairs side of things, people want to see what overseas looks like. People want to see what Western Queensland looks like, because a lot of people, I was at a function a couple of weeks ago with a Courier Mail journalist who thought that there were 30,000 people that lived in Toowoomba, and she didn't realise that there was actually commercial vegetable growing and things in the Lockyer Valley. She thought it was all hobby farming, because she'd never been outside of Brisbane. So that's the sort of ignorance that you're really dealing with, but that's the type of thing you've got to overcome. But having said that, if you can provide a nice snapshot of something different for them to look at, that will attract a metropolitan audience. Second is add a human face to the issue, which is, it's one thing for different rural lobby groups to come out and make a claim. I would say that the human face, though, we want, like people, again, like I said before, the emotion of a small business owner, such as a farmer, trying to be able to argue their case against a multinational corporation or against another thing. People want to see a real world example, a real person that's going through this. And the second most important part of that is to provide figures. What is it going to cost you? Is that a percentage of your income? Is it a figure of what it's going to cost you? Of what you are looking for? A figure is also something a journalist ears will prick up every time you give them a figure. A few weeks ago, I went with John McVeigh up to Cloncurry to cover the beef crisis and the drought and everything up there. We went out to Robert Curley's place out at Cloncurry, at Gypsy Plains out at Cloncurry. One of the smartest things that they did was they provided a spreadsheet of all the costs that they were projecting they were going to have over the next 12 months because of BJD and because of the drought and because of everything like that. I think it came up to about $2 million. A Courier Mail journalist was with us, and he'd lived in Melbourne his whole life and had just moved up to Brisbane, had no idea about anything, didn't even know that Northern Australia was reliant on live export, nothing like that. But he began, and we spent a lot of time trying to explain to him the case and what was going on, but with the situation. And once he thought he was going up to get a nice picture story with a person doing something and then a few lines. He ended up realising the large economic ramifications, but because that landholder was able to provide a public face and be able to provide figures and a story behind their own personal experience, that was the first thing he led the article with, is that they were walking through the yards and Robert Curley pulls out this spreadsheet and shows the journalist all the figures all the losses they're going to have. It becomes the linchpin that he built the whole story around because they provide those figures. The third is find a regular contact, which is probably one of the biggest problems with the metropolitan media, and I see this all the time with myself, is that when I go out on trips with them, it's always someone different. It's always someone different. It's very rare that you see, probably Sue Neils maybe from the Australian, who's obviously a rural writer, but the Courier Mail particularly will always send someone different. And that means that they never really get their teeth into the issue because they're off to the next thing. And so therefore, you can attract a lot more if you start targeting journalists. And probably, it's like off the top of my head, off the Courier Mail, you would have Brian Williams, who's the environment writer. He grew up on a dairy farm, I think, in the Burnett, and he used to write for us a long time ago. John McCarthy as well, obviously with coal seam gas, is one that's been following the issue very, very strongly. But you are best where possible to speak to a journalist directly rather than trying to speak to the editor or the chief of staff, who generally may not have the time to spend that another journalist who is actually fishing for a story may have. The fourth is be prepared to answer stupid questions, which is that there's an assumed knowledge, and in Country Life we report on that, Beef Central, there's an assumed knowledge that we all understand, and there's a shorthand that we can sometimes discuss in, and so therefore we're often talking about very specific parts of a bigger picture. The journalist, though, who's coming from a metropolitan and writing for a metropolitan audience is trying to tell the big picture. And so therefore, again, if I use the example of when we went up with the drought to Cloncurry, the journalist didn't know the different, he didn't know, Bos indicus, Bos taurus, he didn't know the different types of, all that sort of stuff. He had no idea of that. So we had to explain to him the different types of cattle in the different types of regions and how that all shapes the influence of how the whole supply chain's carrying out and therefore the economic ramifications it's all having. So you really need to be able to make sure that the journalist understands, because if they don't understand, they're not going to be able to write about it. And lastly, and probably again most importantly, is what does it mean for the city dweller? That's the biggest question, is that people want to know, the journalist wants to know, what does this policy decision, what impact is this policy decision going to have on the bottom line of the household budget in Smith Street, Brisbane? That's the thing that people need. You need to personalise it, not just from a farming perspective, also but for a city audience, because if you're able to show them that the cost of living is going to rise, and everyone needs to eat, energy and food are two of the most important things, along with shelter, probably the whole fundamentals of life. If you are able to show that the city dweller is going to be out of pocket or is going to be worse off because of this policy decision, because of this bad business decision, because this bad policy decision that's going to impact your business and you're going to have to pass the costs on, or you're going to have to do this or do that, then that is going to be something that the media is going to, in the metropolitan centre, is going to be extremely interested in and is really going to follow through with that. So yeah, and I think that's ones where you can get front pages out of, because no one went poor in newspapers by saying that the cost of living is going to rise. So yep, and that's pretty much it. So yeah, that would be my 5 things. If you took anything today, those 5 things are things to consider when you're trying to attract a metropolitan audience. So thanks very much.